Hi, Jorge.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. It's a cold day here in the Bay Area.
In San Francisco itself, or
I'm right now in Emeryville. Emeryville is the other side of the Bay Bridge, close to Berkeley and Oakland.
okay? Well, let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show on Meaning of Life TV. You are Jorge Ferrer. You're a professor of East-West psychology at the California Institute of Integral Studies. I think, is that right?
That's correct. I'm also going to be teaching in a new online program. It's called Integral and Transpersonal Psychology at CIS. But East-West psychology is where I'm teaching right now.
Okay. And transpersonal psychology is something that we are going to be discussing along with something apparently related called participatory spirituality, of which you are an advocate. And I gather all of this is related to a book you wrote called Revisioning Transpersonal Theory, a Participatory Vision of Human Spirituality.
Mm-hmm.
Now, before we explain what transpersonal psychology and participatory spirituality are, which we will get around to, I gather you see participatory spirituality as addressing a problem in the world, which is that there are all these people with different religious beliefs that may seem incompatible. Sometimes the people are dogmatic about them. Sometimes they are aggressively dogmatic about them.
Yes.
It might be better if they weren't. And various solutions, I guess, have been proposed to this problem. There's one that I want to talk about that you don't think is the best solution, and you see participatory spirituality as an alternative to, and that is what's called perennialism, the so-called perennial philosophy. Do you want to tell us what the perennial philosophy is, first of all, and then we'll talk about why you see it as having shortcomings?
Yes, well, there are many different forms of perennial philosophy, but basically it affirms like a unity and a kind of underlying unity in all religious traditions. And this unity can be defended, for example, as an esoteric core, something that if you go beyond dogmas, beyond doctrines, you find like kind of an experiential core, like, for example, an underlying unique mystical experience that is common across traditions.
Okay.
And I think that's problematic.
So there's two claims here in a way. I mean, one is that this experience that is said to be common to different religious traditions, if kind of obscure, I mean, if not necessarily evident superficially in the religious traditions, it is said to lie in their ancient roots or somewhere. Anyway, it is said to be common to them. And there's first the claim that it is, in fact, common to them. And if you dig hard enough, you will find this tradition in these different religions. And then secondly, there's the claim that this is valid, that this experience we're talking about is a valid form of insight, that it aligns you with the truth or gives you insight into the truth. Now, which of those, or is it both, that you take issue with?
I think I take issue with both in the sense that I don't think there is like a common mystical experience across traditions.
Mm-hmm.
I think different traditions are kind of like co-creating, enacting, bringing forward different spiritual experiences, events, and also perhaps even spiritual worlds and ultimates, So in that way, I disagree with that kind of commonality about one mystical experience across traditions. And I don't think that it's just one experience that is going to reveal kind of the ultimate nature of reality. I think there are many different kind of unfoldings of reality, and the different traditions kind of co-create different unfoldings of reality, and they call it different spiritual ultimates, right? For example, the Christians call it a personal God, or Satchitananda and the Hindus, the Buddhists call it Sunyata. I don't think they're referring to the same thing, and this is one of the issues I have with perennialist thinking.
Whereas the perennialist claim would be that, whether they call it God or Sunyata or whatever, they're talking about ultimate reality, contact with ultimate reality, and it's the same ultimate reality they're all having contact with if it's expressed in so many different ways. And this gets back, I guess, partly to Aldous Huxley's book, The Perennial Philosophy. That's, I guess, where the term comes from. And the perennial philosophy is kind of Eastern in flavor, right? I mean, there is, of course, a Christian mystical tradition. There's Jewish mysticism. There's Islamic mysticism. But I gather that I haven't read Huxley's book, but I gather that the experiences described were probably be more obviously found, let's say, in Buddhism or in Vedanta Hinduism or something like that, right?
That's exactly right, Bob. In many ways, even though the claim is that all traditions agree about that kind of ultimate truth, whenever the main proponents of the perennial philosophy in contemporary times, have been kind of sympathizers with kind of Eastern traditions or Middle Eastern traditions. So Houston Smith, Nasser, Schuon, many of them would say that even though they claim all traditions would agree about that kind of ultimate reality, like for example, they would say Advaita Vedanta has the best or most accurate articulation, right? Mm-hmm. So Nasser is a Sufi, Schuon and Houston Smith favor this kind of a new Advaita version of perennial philosophy,
which is a non-dual. The idea that would be the experience of the self kind of merging with the rest of reality and seeing no distinction between the two.
Exactly, a non-dual monistic metaphysics. Exactly,
mm-hmm. and that's Houston Smith you're talking about, very famous kind of scholar of religions, wrote a famous book on the world of religions.
Exactly, and of course within the field of transpersonal psychology, Ken Wilber, he doesn't longer identify himself with the field, but he was the main proponent of this doctrine. Also Stanislav Grof also would fall into this category, but Ken Wilber also kind of, he describes this kind of ultimate experience in a very Zen, Advaitin ways, it's this kind of one taste, this kind of Atman, Brahman, non-duality, and so forth. Although he has his own version of non-duality that in a way is different than the traditional ones, but that's a different story.
That's interesting, because Ken Wilber is somebody that people keep telling me I should read, but every time I look at one of his books, it seems like I would have to take a whole course in Ken Wilber's system before I could even understand one of his books, right? And life is short. But
that's the drill.
but it's interesting. So you say he was at once identified with transpersonal psychology. Mm-hmm. So why don't you maybe now tell us, before we get more into participatory spirituality, what is transpersonal psychology?
Well, many people will have different stories and definitions of the field, but I would say that, looking at the origins help us to really understand what it is, and it was originated out of the confluence of different schools of thought. One was humanistic psychology, mm-hmm. and the work of Abraham Maslow's, understanding of self-actualization and emphasis on big experiences. Maslow was saying let's study not the pathology, let's study what we can become, right? The potentials of human being, right? So, and then he was one of the founders of transpersonal psychology together with Stanislav Grof, who was coming from Czechoslovakia and then Maryland Institute here in the States, studying psychedelics, studying investigation with LSD psychotherapy. So the confluence of those two, humanistic psychology, entheogenic research or psychedelic research, and there against the countercultural climate of the late 60s and early 70s, mm-hmm. plus the coming of the Eastern traditions into the West and the popularization in the counterculture is what kind of created a fertile ground for the emergence of transpersonal psychology.
So Maslow, whom you mentioned, is famous for this hierarchy of human needs, where he says, okay, I forget what's on the bottom, but it's something like eating, staying alive. And so on, and the needs, and you get up to kind of social needs and so on, and then I forget what's at the top. But I gather the idea is we can be more than we are. At the top, there is a form of fulfillment that we don't all achieve, but it's available to us all or something.
Exactly. And there was something crucial for the emergence of transpersonal psychology, and that was the convergence or apparent convergence between Maslow's peak experiences and then what people were experiencing when they were taking psychedelics in the 60s here in the States. Many people started taking psychedelics recreationally, and then suddenly they realized that it was serious matter, that they were kind of having sometimes the deepest experience of their lives, Sometimes they were mystical experiences, spiritual experiences of different kinds. And then at the same time, the Eastern traditions, like Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism and also Hinduism were coming into the West, Mm-hmm. So people were reading books by popularizers like Alan Watts, and D.T. Suzuki and many others. And then they were realizing holy cow, like, look at that, all those experiences we're having here, some of them like really similar to the ones that are described in the Eastern traditions are something very valid, very important spiritually, and it's not just something that we're kind of like tripping here, or like going into some kind of regressive states as psychoanalysts would want it.
Okay, so those are some of the roots of transpersonal psychology. Now, if someone, if you're at like a cocktail party and somebody says, "So what is transpersonal psychology?" and I have to leave in like 45 seconds, so you have like 2 sentences.
Yes.
What is the shortest encapsulation of transpersonal psych? What it is?
I would say that transpersonal psychology studies the interface of psychology and spirituality and its applications for the contemporary world.
So it is explicitly spiritual, and then it uses that word, and that distinguishes it from a whole lot of psychology. I mean, even therapeutic psychology, which I guess is the tradition it's in, right? So it is explicitly spiritual, and it sounds kind of Eastern. Why the word transpersonal? What does that refer to?
Yeah, transpersonal is a word that many in the field don't feel very happy with, and it has problems. Transpersonal originally meant that people were experimenting states of consciousness in which their sense of identity transcended their normal sense of self. For example, people could experience like, I'm not like just my normal Jorge Ferrer working my like within my what Alan Watts called the ego encapsulated skin, right? Mm-hmm. Right. So and then like sometimes my sense of identity includes other aspects of like nature, or identification with other persons or with entire species, or identification with the cosmos, So that kind of transcendence of like ordinary personal identity is what the term transpersonal originally wanted to convey.
So this gets back to kind of the Eastern roots, the idea that the dissolution of the bounds of the self in some sense, or
yes.
The bounds of the self are not to be taken as final and fixed and rigid.
Exactly, yes.
Now you could find, of course, again, in Christian mysticism, they might describe a feeling as being a union with God, but even then, if it's a union, then the bounds of the self are not as rigid and airtight as they might have seemed. So there is that kind of commonality, but that's what the term transpersonal refers to.
Exactly, and as you're saying, like most Christian mystics, even those that they experience union with God, I mean, they would hold that union like a phenomenological or experiential union that somehow maintain like an ontological gap, an ontological distance, an ontological difference between the creator and the created. And that's a huge difference, with Eastern traditions like Advaita Vedanta, or many new Advaita schools that they said there is no gap, that you are that Atman is Brahman. And this is one of the reasons, among many others, that why the perennial philosophy fails.
Right. So when you say Atman is Brahman as a teaching of Advaita Vedanta, that the idea is that Atman, the self, the soul, the individual soul, is the kind of larger universal soul or something. They're the same. And and that not only is distinguished from Christian mysticism, but from Buddhism. Buddhism has a different interpretation of the breakdown of the bounds of self. It's that the self doesn't even exist. It's not that it gets united. It was an illusion in the first place. So it's not a merger of the self with the self with anything, because the self doesn't exist in the first place. So there are all these differences, and I guess this is one reason you're skeptical of. Perennialism. So what? So participatory spirituality. I gather is that a kind of a subset of transpersonal psychology, or a particular branch of thought that has emerged from transpersonal psychology?
I would call it the latter. I would say that my book. I wrote the book as my dissertation, my doctoral dissertation here at CIS, and it was like, as the title says, a critical revisioning of transpersonal psychology. And then I kind of developed like this notion of participatory spirituality in connection with two other authors, like Richard Turner, and John Heron, and other people who were using the term participatory before me. So in a way, I was trying to bridge the field of transpersonal psychology with that kind of participatory thinking, in that revisioning. So that's what I was trying to do that. But then, I would say that participatory spirituality it goes beyond transpersonal psychology. It's kind of like a spiritual sensitivity, that my second book was on religious studies. And we invited, it was a credited anthology called The Participatory Turn, and we invited scholars from different religious traditions, from Sufism and Christianity and Buddhism and so forth, to write, to engage participatory thinking from the perspective of their traditions. So in a way, many of them, they found participatory elements in their traditions, or the fertile possibility to reconstruct their traditions along the lines of participatory thinking. And that was part of what we're trying to do there.
Okay, and what does the word participatory refer to in this context?
Okay, one of the easiest way I find to explain participatory is in terms of co-creation, and that co-creation can be of three different types at least. One is intrapersonal co-creation, so that our spirituality is co-created by the different aspects of who we are.
So that's within an individual. There is, in a certain sense, participation of the parts of the individual with one another.
Exactly. It's like the participation of the fullness of the person, all of who we are, like the body and the instinct and sexuality and the heart and mind and consciousness, all of the fullness of who we are participating as equals in the co-creation of our spiritual path.
So does that mean they are integrated and coherent and working in harmony, as opposed to there being a lot of internal dissension and conflict, or what?
That's the aim, and that's the horizon, and that's the goal.
I'm in favor of that. I would like that. I would like that. If you can figure out how to bring that to me, I will definitely sign up for your religion.
Exactly, and this is important because so often spirituality gets or the spiritual pursuits gets sabotaged by different parts of ourselves, Sometimes our spiritual ideals are in tension with instinctive drives, or emotional impulses, and so forth, So the aim is to really invite and to gradually align all of who we are, all those worlds in the unfolding of the spiritual path. And that's one dimension.
Okay, now one way religions often address that when there is tension between the spiritual goals and certain impulses is to, in one way or another, subdue the impulses. I mean, I would say that, I grew up Southern Baptist, and so things like, lust and anger, they were things we should struggle against internally. At the other, and then would say mindfulness meditation, the idea is not so much to repress certain feelings, but to have a perspective on them that makes you less enslaved to them ultimately. So so that's a common thing is that, in one way or another, subdue the influence of certain kinds of feelings. Now, is that what happens with participatory spirituality, or is it more like, no, let them all blossom and magically work together?
Well, I wish there was magic for that.
Me too.
Takes a lot of work, but it's more about the latter. Imagine that the instincts. Let's use the metaphor, the image of a tiger, right? The tiger is the instincts, or the sexual world, the instinctive primary world, and many traditions they would put the tiger in a cage. And say, let's put the tiger in a cage, and you are outside the cage and develop spirituality. Other traditions, they would just, tame the tiger, tame the tiger. And we have beautiful images of this in many traditions, in Buddhist traditions, Taoist traditions, about taming of the animals, taming the tiger, or taming the instinct, not repressing, but just taming it, In participatory spirituality, the idea would be that the tiger is running by your side with you, running together, and its running helps you running to moving towards your spiritual goal. So you are using all the instinctive energy. The idea is to align your instincts with your consciousness and your heart, so that there is another difference here is between the sublimation and integration. Right? Many spiritual traditions talk about sublimation of the instincts, right? So the idea is that you are using kind of the energy of one level of your being, for example, the instinctive energy, to open your heart in agape or to catapult consciousness to different state of consciousness, like in Tantra, okay? But this is like using one energy at the service of the others. In participatory spirituality, the idea is that it's about the integration of those energies. So it's not just using one energy at the service of the other, but about the mutual transformation of the two energies, so that the energy of our consciousness gets vitalized and even erotized by the vital energy. And our primary instinctive world gets transformed too, with an evolutionary dimension beyond its kind of instinctive drives.
Okay, so far it's sounding kind of abstract. I think I'm going to ask you a little about how you actually actualize this, what kinds of spiritual disciplines you exercise or what. But first, let me just get a little clearer on one point. So, you have these impulses, like including anger and lust, and I assume you would say there is such a thing as giving vent to your anger or giving vent to your lust in a way that is not consistent with spiritual goals, right? So there is some notion of constraining the manifestation of these impulses, right?
Yes, I know. I agree. I know what you are coming from, and I agree with you, of course. But I would say like constraint is a word. I would say like some kind of like self-regulation.
Right.
But the goal and the aim is that self-regulation is kind of like temporary. The goal is that. That primary wall is transformed, is transformed in contact with energies of the heart, in contact with energies of consciousness, so that you don't need to constrain it anymore, so that it kind of like it arises, or it gets kind of like gets activated in the right measure according to what is constructive in each situation. And I know that sounds like abstract too, but yes.
So tell me, what if you practice this spirituality? What kinds of things do you do? Are there practices like meditative practices or group rituals or what?
Yes. Well, one of the practices I've been kind of co-facilitating for many years, and that it embodies these principles. But again, it's not the only one. For me, participatory spiritual practice are practices that are embodied, that are relational, and that they are inquiry-driven, that they are not like about like trying necessarily to get like to truths that have been already put forward in the past, but that are really open-ended, to find or to enact to new truths. So there's all these dimensions, But on my side, I've been kind of facilitating and working with interactive embodied meditations that bring together like kind of like the field of somatics, and also the kind of like the contemplative awareness of the contemplative traditions. And this is important because for these different worlds that shape us to engage in the spiritual path, they need to be vitalized and they need to be kind of enlightened. They need to have consciousness and energy. And those worlds, because for mind-centered education and mind-centered culture, normally they are in different, developmental stages. They are not ready to participate immediately, with the mind and consciousness in a spiritual path, So they need to be kind of awakened. They need to be awakened. So these meditations are very simple, but involve like contemplative, mindful physical contact among practitioners to kind of like
physical
awaken
contact among individuals.
Correct.
Wait, is there hugging involved? If there's hugging involved, I'm afraid I can't be part of your religion.
Well, imagine that even though I live and I work in California, in those meditations, hugging is not necessary. Okay. That's the idea.
Good.
Yes.
Okay.
But, Bob, I know that time is passing, and I want to make sure that we cover the other two aspects or meanings of participatory, because this is just one. Okay. The intrapersonal is just one meaning. And the other is the interpersonal, interpersonal. And this is like like the participation means co-creation with the other, with other human beings, with nature, with perhaps non-human entities that some practitioners claim they encounter in the spiritual endeavors, So there's like kind of like this relational, very interpersonal dimension to participatory spirituality. And then the last one, and perhaps the more sometimes being critiqued harder for this one, especially by people in more conservative traditions, is like the idea of transpersonal co-creation. The idea that we can co-create with that kind of mystery out of which everything arises, with that kind of creative energy of life and the cosmos, we can co-create our spiritual path, So in a way, we can like really innovate, in our spirituality. We don't need to follow the steps of our forerunners necessarily, although they are always source of inspiration. We can also move forward and beyond.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so these second two, the second and third meanings of participatory have to do respectively with a kind of interaction with other human beings.
Yes.
And an interaction with something kind of out there. I don't know, is it a divine force or a mystical energy or what?
I call it the mystery. I prefer the term mystery, and by mystery, what I mean is, it's kind of the creative energy of life, cosmos, or perhaps even reality. The generative force, that creativity, and I think it's the way I frame it is that it's kind of non-determined or undetermined, because as soon as you label, with any kind of like attribute, you go into kind of the problem of sectarianism, you are kind of like favoring some traditions over other traditions. And this is one of the things that participatory pluralism is trying to break down, is trying to stop the fundamentalist wars among traditions, All spiritual practitioners, most of them, they can be like, they believe deep down that the tradition is not only true for them, but it's like superior, right? Mm-hmm. It's like superior bet not only for them, but for everybody. And I've called like this predicament spiritual narcissism, the deep-seated belief that my spiritual choice is the best, not only for me, but for the rest of humankind or for most of them.
Okay, but don't you think participatory spirituality is the best choice? I mean, really, don't you?
I mean, okay, there is a way that is impossible to avoid that, but there are ways to minimize the problem, For example, when you understand participatory spirituality, not like as a new religion or as a new movement, but a sensitivity that can be incorporated across different traditions. Like, for example, and this is happening already, like Christian and Buddhist and Hindu practitioners, they are incorporating the body more, and they are being, many of them, like less restrictive with sexuality, and they're kind of like becoming more relational and so forth, and they are more open in their inquiry, So in a way, I see it more as a sensitivity, more than a kind of like a spiritual tradition in itself or an orientation.
So being less restrictive about sexuality is part of the deal?
I would say that sexuality is important because for me, sexuality is one of the first it's an open soil for the transformation in the person of that creative energy of life, In a way, it's the energy that we use to create another human form, right? Another human life, The miracle of life comes to that energy. So it's really connected to that very creative energy of life, So as we put, if sexuality is not an open soil, it's like full of blocks and ideologies and like kind of like repression, the contact with that creative energy lessens. So I would say that there is something there, there is something there about making that world porous or more permeable to the presence of that creative energy, for a fully creative or participatory spirituality to come forward.
Okay. And on this issue of when I said, well, what do you call this thing that you're making contact with that's out there? And you kind of chose a term that is not really associated with any of the main existing spiritual traditions, and I gather that's part of the idea, that you don't want to sound like you are favoring any of the existing religious traditions. But are you also saying that, like, if members of those religious traditions want to continue to use their own terminology, God, sunyata, whatever, that's fine, and you could think of them as engaging in participatory spirituality and let them keep their nomenclature?
Yes.
Okay. But
Exactly
then
right.
but then how is that different from perennialism? That sounds like perennialism, right? I mean, you're saying okay, you're calling it God, you're calling it sunyata, but you don't realize it's actually participatory spirituality.
Yes. No.
Okay.
Well, the difference is that no, this is good. This is a good question. Thank you. The big difference for me is like what I see is like the different traditions are kind of like developing and co-creating different spiritual worlds. In a way, like the perennial philosophy can be seen like this kind of diagram of like different kind of like paths reaching to the same peak of the mountain, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or different rivers to the same ocean, right? And what I'm saying is more like imagine like a tree, that emerges from the same root, that undetermined creative energy of life, but it moves into different directions,
Mm-hmm.
and the branches can overlap. So you find very often overlaps across traditions, but they are moving different creative directions, and I think that's really beautiful and something to celebrate, like Buddhists are kind of creating perhaps subtle worlds and Buddha lands, and understandings of spirituality, of emptiness and codependent arising, and the Christians are like co-creating with this mystic something about a personal God. I think all that is fantastic, and I would like those traditions to still continue with their own ventures, and at the same time, I think, and this is where my kind of like more normative kind of hat comes in, like I think it's really good that traditions and practitioners in general, they become like more embodied in their pursuits, less dissociative when they work, more in radical relationship with others as equals, and more also open-ended in their inquiries,
Mm-hmm.
But again, that's an invitation for many practitioners that they can take up or not in the context of their own tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that all traditions have the potential to become very embodied and holistic on their own terms.
Mm-hmm. So there are people practicing Christianity or Buddhism or whatever whom you might point to and say that is what they're doing is, given what they're feeling and the way they're going about it, that is participatory spirituality, even if they've never heard the term and they haven't signed up to be participatory spiritualists or anything. That's the way you look at it. You're seeing trends, you're seeing manifestations of this worldview in different religions, and that's like fine. You're willing to leave it like that. You're not asking that they abandon what their pre-existing tradition and sign up for participatory spiritualism or anything.
Exactly. In a way, like, when we put together that anthology on religious traditions, that's what we wrote in the introduction, I say we're kind of like, in a way, we're giving voice to an emerging contemporary spiritual ethos that we see happening across traditions, especially in the contemporary West, modern West, but also in Asia, forms of engaged Buddhism, like more concerned with like social ecological concerns, forms of embodied spirituality, here in the West, like, for example, Reggie critique of some forms of Buddhist practices disembodied, These are kind of like critiques that are internal to the tradition, and they're moving in those directions that we call participatory. Mm-hmm. So yes, the answer is yes.
Okay. The now you keep using the word embodied. Is this related to another term I hear that I really don't have a clear sense of is like embodied cognition, and so that's a term I'm hearing. Is this related? Do you subscribe to this idea of embodied cognition?
One of the big influences of this what I call participatory spirituality, it is Francisco Varela, right, and Thompson and Roche work on an active paradigm of cognition, mm-hmm, that in a way takes cognition to be embodied action. So,
and what does that mean? I keep seeing this and I can't get a fix on it. What is that? Today I read I happened to read, yes, not in preparation for this, but something associating embodied cognition with, it was a particular view of what perception and what perception is, and it had to do, it seemed to be the idea that we don't really construct our perceptual field, it's more like an absorption of the information out there, but that probably has nothing to do with what you're about to say, so go ahead.
Let me try. It would be great to have Francisco. Well, he died a number of years ago, as you know. But my understanding is that, like they were reacting about what they call a representational paradigm of cognition, according to which human cognition is like a representation of like a world that is existing out there, independent of our cognition, And this is like something that has been critiqued harshly in philosophy for many decades, right? The idea of a pre-given world, of an objective world that exists there, and then all what we have is our kind of like our different kind of like snapshots of different objective world existing independently from us. And what they are saying, understanding, is that cognition is more like a kind of like it's co-determined. It's like a co-creation in a way. It's like the organism and the environment, like they co-create each other, in the same event of coming together.
That's the embodied cognition view?
I would say so because of course all cognition is taking place also through embodied organs like sense of sight, sense of listening, and so forth. Take for example, a beautiful example, from Thich Nhat Hanh, a contemporary Buddhist teacher, talks about this, eating mindfully or a tangerine, right? Okay, so the flavor of a tangerine, comes together, and that's what Thich Nhat Hanh would say. It comes together. That's the coming together, of the particular object we have in our hands and our physical senses, the senses that makes us human, So that tangerine for another kind of species or another even unicellular kind of like organism would be something very different, right? It would be maybe, and it would mean different things. It would have a different meaning to them, So I think that's what they say, that depending on kind of your embodied cognitive apparatus, the world manifests and falls in different ways. And the claim is that there is no independent, fully objective world out there. There is something out there, no one denies that, but there is not just one single viewpoint that can capture that world as objective.
Okay, then maybe I misread what I read today, or else it was flat out wrong, because I took it to be identifying embodied cognition with what is sometimes called like naive realism, the idea that what you're seeing is exactly what's out there independent of you. But embodied cognition doesn't buy into that. It is of the view, which Buddhism shares, that we assign meaning to the world out there, and in that process construct our perceptions.
Yes, and they would claim even further, and I'm sure I think Buddhist schools also, some Buddhist schools will go there too, that the world itself is being co-created in that encounter. It's not just our different perceptions of our world, but it's the world itself, that emerges in co-arising and co-dependent with our perceptual apparatus in different ways. And that's a more radical claim.
So and it's a metaphysical claim, right? I mean, that's almost not just psychology. It's like metaphysics to say that consciousness plays a role in the construction of reality, right? I mean, is it that claim?
Yes, it's a philosophical claim, it's a metaphysical claim, but Francisco Varela and many cognitive psychologists, they would claim that there is a lot of cognitive scientific evidence to back up a lot of that claim, at least, but of course, ultimately, I agree with you, it's philosophical and metaphysical.
Is there a particular experimental finding or anything that is cited to back up the idea of this kind of constructive role we play, or the interactive construction of reality?
Well, I remember, for example, in the book The Embodied Mind, Varela, Eleanor Roche, and Thompson. Eleanor Roche is a professor of UC Berkeley here in Berkeley, and she's an expert in the visual cognition. And one of the things that she's bringing in evidence that she's bringing to the book to back up this claim is that there is many more neuronal pathways kind of like going outward from the visual cortex than inward, So in a way, like what we are seeing out there is much more an outward construction of our brain than an inward input, So claims like that can back up that view. But again, ultimately, I agree with you. It's a philosophical viewpoint.
Okay, so embodied. Anyway, the embodied view, the embodied cognition view, it's part of transpersonal psychology, or part of this participatory branch of transpersonal psychology, or both?
I would say that a bit of both. I would say that participatory transpersonal scholars who have been bringing like this, this kind of like a dimension of embodiment, like more to the foreground in transpersonal psychology. But again, there are many other scholars like Rosemary Anderson and other transpersonal scholars who have been working with the body and trying to make transpersonal psychology more embodied in different ways. Okay. So it's a bit of both.
And then the other term you used a couple times is radical, what? Radical participation with others, or what how did radical...
Well, the last one was like you mean the transpersonal participation?
Maybe you said radically transpersonal. You said radically something or radical something, but maybe...
Oh, like radical relationality with others?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think what I mean by that, there are different things I mean by that term, but one is that, here in the Bay Area, when I read here in the Bay Area many years ago, and it still is going on today, there is a lot of kind of like a spiritual hierarchies going on, mm-hmm. Like people look down, people look up, according to some kind of perceived spiritual level or a stage of development, mm-hmm. And for me, I kind of like tend to break down that with this kind of more radical relationality in which like we are all teachers and students, of course, spiritual teachers can teach me many things, but perhaps I can teach them other things. So in this world of participatory spirituality, it's a world that affirms this radical relationality, in which human beings cannot be graded, as a whole, according to their spiritual development. Mm-hmm. And this is one problem that transpersonal psychology many years ago was falling into, especially in the hands of Ken Wilber, and other kind of hierarchical thinkers, who were grading people according to levels of spiritual development, mm-hmm. And that was problematic, I think.
Okay. So you said that, there are people out there who don't think of themselves as doing participatory spirituality in various religions, but you might look at them and say, yeah, that's kind of a version of participatory spirituality, given the way they look at the world and conduct mm-hmm. their lives and the experiences they have and so on. Separate from that, are there people... out in California maybe or elsewhere who think of themselves as doing participatory spirituality and like that's their practice? They're not Buddhist, they're not Hindu, they're doing participatory spirituality. Is that like a thing?
I hope not.
Well, would you describe yourself that way? Are you the only one in the world?
No. I say I hope not, because I've never been in the business of creating a school or a spiritual school or a spiritual tradition and things like this, If some people take it that way, and I don't know, I think I would feel very sad because my impulse is more like, take these ideas, take these kind of orientations, and apply them into your spiritual path and create your own spiritual path. And perhaps that takes the place within Buddhism, or perhaps it's an eclectic path, like very New Age or spiritual but not religious path, right? Or perhaps it's something else, But I wouldn't want people to go into my religion is participatory spirituality. I would be very, very sad. That might happen. I hope it doesn't happen, and I will do it certainly everything in my power against that.
Okay, so if a religion of participatory spirituality does emerge, you will do everything in your power to wipe it out.
Absolutely.
Okay. In closing, tell us a little bit about the California Institute of Integral Studies. Is that does it have a predominant worldview, or it's just kind of various people taking, in some cases, maybe vaguely Eastern approaches to things, or what?
It's tremendously diverse today. Originally, it was kind of connected to the teachings of the Indian mystic Sri Aurobindo. And the CIS emerges from the California Institute of Asian Studies, Haridas Chaudhary, a disciple of Aurobindo, Alan Watts, and Frederick Spielberg, a professor of Asian studies in Stanford. So those three put that together, but then it kind of evolved throughout the years and the decades, and now it's an extremely diverse environment in which there is, I would say, a spiritual foundation, but that spiritual foundation, there is no one dogma, there is no one doctrine, there is no, all religious traditions are being taught, indigenous traditions and shamanism and Asian and Western, and even there are programs that they don't identify themselves explicitly with having a spiritual foundation, They're more like kind of like secular, kind of post-colonial or socially engaged in the world, like trying to do the right thing according to their views, but not from a explicitly spiritual perspective, But I would say that traditionally what has identified CIS has been like this kind of integration of spirituality into academia. And it still is part of the mission of CIS, and we do that in many different ways, not only in terms of content, but also teaching students how to engage their spiritual values as they develop their scholarship, for example.
And so what kind of degrees can you get by studying it? Can you get like a master's in psychology, or what are the disciplines?
Yes, well, there are many degrees in psychology, like clinical psychology and like somatics and drama therapy, expressive arts therapy, like healing arts. That's one school. And the other school is called a School of Consciousness and Transformation. And that's where my program is. It's called East-West Psychology, that involves kind of the integration of Western psychology, Western traditions, Eastern traditions, and indigenous and shamanic traditions in this dialogue of psychology and spirituality and applications, There is philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness. There is social and cultural anthropology, women's spirituality, and so forth. So there are like two different schools. One is perhaps more applied to clinical practice, and the other is kind of like more applied to scholarship and social applications.
Okay. Sounds very California.
Of course.
Sounds like you found the right home for it. So and just to summarize, I mean, what you're doing is, in a sense, what would you say, providing. You're trying to provide tools to people in various spiritual traditions to use, you hope, constructively. Is in other words, you said you're not trying to start a religion or something, but so are you? You're just offering kind of tools and perspectives, and people can take what they will. And
I think it's a good way to put it. Very simple way to put it, and very accurate too. Like I think I'm trying to provide a sense of tools and orientations and notions. For example, I'll just give you one more. In Buddhism, there is of course something called the Bodhisattva vow, right? The Bodhisattva vow that one renounces liberation, until all sentient beings are liberated. Okay, so in the context of a participatory spirituality, I have suggested like the idea of like a integral bodhisattva vow, in which like the conscious mind renounces full liberation until the body and the instincts and the fullness of the human heart can be free as well. And this is important because, for example, if we get liberated only in our conscious minds, and a lot of disciplines like work predominantly there, in the realms of consciousness, we can't believe we're fully liberated because our sense of self normally identifies itself with our conscious mind,
Right.
We can't believe we're fully liberated when in fact we are not. Parts of ourselves are still alienated. And of course, this is, I think, a sign of this is, when we have like all these, problems with the spiritual teachers who are kind of like supposedly enlightened, and then later they behave like in immoral ways,
Right.
Or in very problematic ways or sexually inappropriate ways, I think that would suggest for me that different parts of themselves, are not as awakened and as discerning as their conscious minds might be.
Yeah, I think there are Buddhists who might say that people like that the Buddhist texts, if you read in their fullness, would not call people like that liberated until they've done what you say, right? I mean, there's a strong moral strand in Buddhism, and I think part of enlightenment is being so fully liberated that you almost naturally behave in a moral way, right?
Yeah, but this is a great conversation. But I would say that like that the question of morality and enlightenment is a fascinating topic, and there are many different schools of thought.
Sure.
Some people talk about like mystics and enlightened mystics as going beyond morality, right? Other people think about them as very moral. And other people think about them about something that, they can do anything they want, right? Almost immoral because they are free to do whatever they want,
Right.
But I would say that if we look historically, and look historically, look at cases, what we see is like tremendous moral ambiguity in the mysticism, in the mystical sages, and of course here you have like issues of different moral codes, Western codes versus let's say Indian codes, but also you have a lot of different personality factors and perhaps developmental factors, If we take seriously the idea that there are different developmental tasks, that we need to go in order to achieve competence, in different levels, of intelligence in our being, Perhaps some of these Indian sages, they were very evolved in their consciousness, but not, maybe sexually they were pre-adolescents.
Right. I mean, I guess you're right, this is kind of largely a separate conversation.
Yes.
But I guess I was thinking the Buddhist enlightenment in the extreme involves, on a steer reading of it, is involving transcending attachment and aversion in all forms. And if you really transcend those, then you're not going to be like sexually exploiting people, and you're not going to, you're not going to be doing all these things that the kind of naughty gurus do, right?
Yes, but not exploiting. But things are more tricky. I had a very good friend. Of course, I will not be able to disclose names. A very good friend who has been like a Zen student for many, many years with a very venerable Japanese Zen teacher in their 80s. Perhaps he's dead now. And she told me about sexual contact with this Zen teacher throughout the years, and was very constructive and beautiful. And the Zen teacher has the discernment, to approach someone that could live that sexual contact with him. And for this venerable Zen teacher, he told her that was like an expression of love, and it was something really beautiful that happened there, So not all sexual contacts among teachers and students are problematic. For me, the dividing line is when the teacher in particular, they don't have the discernment, to understand that contact with this person is going not to be constructive, is going to be, and of course when they are preaching one thing and doing something else. Right. That's very different. There are some traditions that more a bit iconoclastic around these questions. For example, in Zen, right. Sexuality has been like, many things happen there, Other traditions have like very strict morals around sexuality, So those two things are dividing lines. Is the teacher having the discernment, and also at the same time is like, are they preaching, what they are doing or not?
Well, I guess the first thing I'd want to know is whether all of this particular Zen master's students with whom he has had sexual contact feel equally happy about the outcome before I really pronounce him as being completely and consistently discerning. But,
yes, exactly, absolutely. For all I know, no one has accused this teacher of sexual harassment or sexual misconduct, So either he only had this contact with my friend, or the way he did it, he had like this tremendous discernment in which he approached the right people, and it was a very beautiful, constructive thing. And at the same time, it's a very delicate thing when there is a power differential,
There's a huge power differential.
It's huge, exactly. I agree with you. So I think it's something in general to be discouraged, and but at the same time, there are certain cases in which it has been. We only hear about the problems, right? We hear about the scandals, when the students who have been harmed and hurt accuse their teachers. Mm-hmm. We don't hear about the success stories.
Well, we just heard one apparently. So maybe this is a first. Okay, well, listen, thank you so much, Jorge. This has been very interesting. There's a lot more that we could have talked about. Maybe we'll have a chance to do it on another occasion.
Thank you very much, Bob, for the invitation.
Okay, take care.
Thank you very much. Take care.